Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your own life? Let me tell you about the afternoon my daughter-in-law walked into my home and tried to take it from me. Not with force, not with threats, with something far more dangerous, the quiet assumption that I no longer mattered. But before I share what happened, I want to ask you something. What would you do if someone you loved looked you in the eye and told you that your home, the place where you raised your children, buried your husband, and planted your dreams, no longer belonged to your future? Would you smile and step aside? Would you tell yourself that family harmony matters more than your own dignity? Or would you find a strength you didn't know you still had? This is the story of how I found mine. Chapter 1: The Invasion That Didn't Look Like One. "What a gorgeous house," my daughter-in-law Vanessa said as she slowly turned in a full circle, her eyes scanning the dining room like a general surveying conquered territory. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains my mother had crocheted decades ago, casting pale rectangles across the walnut table my late husband, Daniel, had built with his own hands more than 30 years earlier. Every scratch on its surface held a memory. Every corner carried a story, the deep groove near the edge. That was from Oliver's 6th birthday, when he'd slammed his toy truck into the wood in a fit of pure, unbridled excitement. The faint water ring near the center. From the night Daniel and I stayed up until 3 in the morning, talking about whether we could afford to send Oliver to the summer science program he'd been accepted into. We couldn't, not really, but we found a way. We always found a way. Vanessa rested her palm on that table as though she were checking the temperature of a feverish child. To her, it was just another piece of furniture waiting to be rearranged. To me, it was a monument, a testament to a marriage, a family, a life built with intention and love. "Mom is going to love living here," she continued, her voice carrying that particular brand of confidence that makes assumptions sound like facts. She didn't ask, she didn't even glance in my direction to see if I was nodding. She simply spoke, and in her mind that was enough. The decision had been made, I simply hadn't been informed. Have you ever been in a room where someone says something so outrageous, so completely disconnected from reality, that your brain actually stalls? That was me, sitting in my own dining room, holding a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching a woman 15 years my junior plan my future without my consent. I didn't interrupt, I simply lifted my cup and watched. Vanessa moved to the bay window, the one that overlooked the garden Daniel had designed in his final spring, when he already knew he was dying but refused to stop planting. He'd spent those last weeks on his knees in the dirt, insisting that the roses needed him, that the tomatoes required his attention, that life continued even when yours was ending. "I'm thinking the upstairs bedroom with the sunrise view will be perfect for Mom," Vanessa said, her measuring tape already appearing from her handbag like a magician's prop. "Oliver and I can convert the basement into a home office. It's practically another apartment down there." Across the table, my son Oliver lowered his eyes to his dessert plate. He picked at the last bite of chocolate cake, my mother's recipe, the one she taught me when I was 12, standing on a step stool in her tiny kitchen without saying a single word. His silence spoke louder than anything else. It screamed of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, who had known exactly how it would unfold, and who had decided that the path of least resistance was the only path he could walk. I looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered when my brave little boy had become a man who was afraid of his own wife. And Martha, Vanessa's mother, smiled in agreement as she admired the windows, her eyes gleaming with the particular satisfaction of someone who believes the universe has finally arranged itself in her favor. "It'll save everyone so much money," Martha added, as though she were doing me a favor by planning her own occupation of my home. Let me pause here and ask you another question. When did saving money become a justification for taking someone else's life apart? When did convenience become a currency more valuable than dignity? My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 67 years old, widowed for nearly 6 years, and I have lived in this house for over 4 decades. Every brick reminds me of the life Daniel and I built together, brick by brick, argument by argument, dream by dream. We planted the maple tree in the front yard when Oliver was 5 years old, a spindly thing that the nursery had practically given away because no one thought it would survive. Daniel wrapped it in burlap that first winter, and every spring after we held our breath until we saw the first green buds. That tree is taller than the house now. Its roots run deeper than most relationships I've known. We painted every room ourselves because we couldn't afford professional decorators. Daniel's shoulders ached for weeks after we did the dining room ceiling. I still remember the way he stood in the doorway afterward, paint in his hair, grinning like he'd built the Sistine Chapel. "Not bad for a couple of kids from Queens, Elle," he'd said, and I'd laughed until I cried because we weren't kids anymore, but in that moment, with paint on our hands and hope in our hearts, we felt immortal. Nothing inside these walls happened by accident. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every slightly crooked floorboard is a chapter in a story that only I am still alive to tell. Vanessa, however, acted as though she were touring a property she'd already purchased. "The guest room would make a lovely craft room for Mom," she said, pulling that measuring tape from her handbag with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I'll just check if her sewing cabinet fits." She actually began measuring, without asking, without hesitation, without even the pretense of permission. The soft clink of my cup against its saucer echoed through the dining room like a gunshot in a cathedral. I placed it down with deliberate care, and then I looked directly at her. Not at Oliver, not at Martha, at her. "Nose." One word, nothing more. The room became perfectly still. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa blinked twice, a slow, mechanical gesture, like a computer processing unfamiliar data, before forcing a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I'm sorry. My answer is no." She stared at me, waiting for a smile that never came, waiting for the punchline, for the just kidding, for the retreat that women of her generation seemed to expect from women of mine. But I had stopped retreating the day I buried Daniel. I had learned that the space you surrender today becomes the ground you lose forever. "I think you've misunderstood," she replied, her voice still polite, although irritation was already creeping in at the edges like water staining a ceiling. "We're only trying to help you. This house is far too large for one person." I understood every word. I folded my hands calmly on the table, the same hands that had held Daniel's as he took his last breath, that had rocked my grandchildren to sleep, that had planted roses and pulled weeds, and built a life worth defending. "What I don't understand," I said, each word measured and deliberate, "is why you're assigning bedrooms in a house that doesn't belong to you." Oliver shifted uneasily in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him like an old friend clearing its throat. "Mom," he began, that single syllable carrying a universe of warning and pleading. I raised my hand gently. "I'm speaking." He fell silent again, and in that silence I saw something flicker across his face, not anger, not defiance, but the ghost of a boy who had once known that his mother was the safest harbor in any storm. I wondered where that boy had gone, and whether any part of him still lived inside the man who wouldn't meet my eyes. Vanessa's smile tightened until it looked like it might crack her face. "We've discussed this for months," she said, as though months of secret conversations conferred some kind of legitimacy. "You may have discussed it," I answered. "You simply forgot to include the homeowner." Martha cleared her throat, a delicate sound like a dove cooing in the wrong season. "I wouldn't be any trouble," she offered, her voice carrying that particular blend of helplessness and expectation that some women cultivate like a greenhouse orchid. "I never said you would," I turned toward her, my voice softer but no less firm. "But that doesn't change the answer." Vanessa leaned forward, her forearms pressing into the table that Daniel had built, and I saw her knuckles whiten. "Elena, we're family." "Exactly," I didn't blink. "Families help each other. They also respect each other's boundaries." Oliver finally found his voice, though it emerged thin and frayed, like a rope that has borne too much weight. "Mom, those stairs are getting harder for you." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly, tragically predictable, the concern that arrives only when it serves someone else's agenda. "I swim every morning," I said. "I knows. I mow my own lawn. I knows. I shovel my own driveway." He looked embarrassed, the way men do when their chivalry is revealed as convenience rather than conviction. "I think I'm managing just fine," I finished. Vanessa sighed dramatically, a performance worthy of a stage she clearly believed she deserved. "We already ended Mom's apartment lease." That caught my attention. The room seemed to tilt slightly as though the floor had become unlevel. "You what?" "She's moving next month." "And whose decision was that?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty, the momentary understanding that she had overplayed her hand. "Well, ours." I nodded slowly, the way Daniel used to when he was about to deliver a verdict he knew would be unwelcome. So, I said, each syllable dropping like a stone into still water, you created a problem and expected me to solve it. It's not like that. It sounds exactly like that. For a few moments nobody spoke. The silence was so complete that I could hear the maple tree's leaves brushing against the window screen, a sound like whispered secrets. Finally, I stood and began gathering the empty dessert plates, my movements calm and methodical. I'm sure you'll find a wonderful place for Martha, I said as I carried the dishes toward the kitchen, my back straight, my head high. There are several lovely retirement communities nearby. Vanessa's voice sharpened behind me, cutting through the air like a blade. She's not going to one of those places. Then you'll need another plan. She followed me into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile that Daniel and I had laid ourselves during the winter of 1989, our breath visible in the unheated room, our fingers numb, our hearts warm. You can't seriously expect her to start over. I rinsed a plate beneath warm water, watching the last traces of chocolate swirl down the drain. I expect everyone to make decisions about their own lives. You have all this extra space. And I also have the right to decide who lives in it. Her expression changed completely. The pleasant smile, the concerned daughter-in-law, the helpful family member, all of it vanished like a mask slipping from its hooks. What remained was something harder, hungrier, and far more honest. You'd really choose an empty house over your own family. I dried my hands with the towel that had hung on this same hook for 20 years, faded but still serviceable, like so many things in my life. This house isn't empty, I said. She frowned, confused by an answer that didn't fit her narrative. I live here. Neither of us spoke again. A few minutes later, Oliver quietly thanked me for dinner while avoiding eye contact, his voice so low I barely caught the words. Vanessa barely said goodbye, a curt nod, a turn on her heel, the door closing with a finality that felt like a chapter ending. Martha offered me a small apologetic smile before following them outside, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though she were beginning to understand that she had been a pawn in someone else's game. I watched through the front window as they climbed into Oliver's SUV. Vanessa talked with animated gestures, her hands cutting through the air like weapons, while Oliver kept both hands tightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed forward. He never looked back. I closed the curtains. The silence that settled over the house felt peaceful, not empty, peaceful. There is a difference, and it took me 6 decades to learn it. For the first time that afternoon, I poured myself another cup of black coffee and sat beside the living room window, the one that looks out at the maple tree. Daniel used to tell me that people reveal their true intentions the moment someone tells them no. Until then, everyone assumes they deserve a yes. He was a wise man, my Daniel, wise enough to know that the word no is sometimes the most loving thing you can say, both to yourself and to the people who have forgotten how to hear it. As the evening sun filled the room with warm golden light, I realized something important. That single word hadn't ended the conversation, it had only begun one. Chapter 2: The Boxes That Weren't Mine. The following Tuesday my doorbell rang just after 10 in the morning. I was in my sunroom, reading a novel I'd borrowed from the library, a cup of tea cooling on the side table. When I opened the door, Vanessa stood on my porch with 2 large cardboard boxes stacked in her arms, her smile so bright it could have powered the streetlights. "Good morning, Alina," she said cheerfully, as though nothing unpleasant had happened a few days earlier. "These are just a few of Mom's things. They'll only stay here for a little while." Before I could answer, before I could even process what was happening, she stepped past me and carried the boxes into my hallway. She placed them beside the staircase as though she belonged there, as though the threshold of my home were merely a suggestion rather than a boundary. "There," she said proudly, brushing her hands together with the satisfaction of a job well done. "We'll organize everything once the move is finished." I folded my arms. What move? She paused, her smile faltering for just a moment before recovering. "Ours." "I believe I already answered that." She waved a dismissive hand, the gesture of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Oh, you'll come around." Without another word, she walked back outside, climbed into her car and drove away. She never asked permission. She never acknowledged my refusal. She simply assumed that possession would become acceptance, that if she filled my home with her mother's belongings, I would have no choice but to accept the situation. I stood in the hallway for a long moment looking at those boxes. They weren't mine, neither was the decision behind them, and something inside me, something that had been sleeping for too long, began to wake up. Have you ever had someone treat your boundaries like a speed bump they could simply drive over? Have you ever watched someone take the first step into your life and known, with absolute certainty, that if you didn't stop them now, they would keep walking until they had taken everything? I walked into the garage, wheeled out my old hand truck, the one Daniel had used for 20 years to haul everything from firewood to furniture, and carefully loaded both boxes onto it. They were heavier than they looked, filled with dishes, blankets, and framed photographs, the accumulated debris of a life that was not, and would never be, mine to store. I rolled them straight back onto the front porch beneath the covered entrance, where they would stay dry if it rained, but where they would be unmistakably outside my home. Then I took out my phone and sent Oliver a short message. Vanessa left Martha's belongings here. They're waiting outside. Please collect them before tonight. Nothing more, no anger, no lecture, just facts. I had learned long ago that emotion is the currency of manipulation, and I was done spending it. Less than an hour later my phone rang. Oliver. "Mom," he said wearily, that single syllable carrying the weight of a man caught between two loyalties he didn't know how to balance. "You didn't have to leave the boxes outside." I certainly did. Vanessa was only trying to get organized. "In my house," I added, the words gentle but unyielding. He sighed, that particular exhalation of a man who has run out of arguments but hasn't yet found the courage to change sides. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No, Oliver," I spoke gently, the way I used to when he was a child and had skinned his knee, when my voice was the only thing that could make the world feel safe again. "I'm making my boundaries clear." He remained silent, and in that silence I could hear the war raging inside him, the husband who wanted peace, the son who wanted approval, the man who had forgotten that he was allowed to want both without sacrificing either. "If someone stores belongings in a house without permission," I continued, my voice steady as the oak tree in my backyard, "they're assuming ownership they don't have. They're just boxes. They're the beginning." Another long pause followed, filled with the static of unspoken words and abandoned hopes. "I'll come after work," he finally said. "I'll be home." That evening he arrived alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded me of the watercolor Daniel had given me for our 10th anniversary. Without saying much, Oliver carried both boxes back to his vehicle. He looked tired, older somehow, as though he were caught between two worlds and belonged to neither. The lines around his eyes were deeper than I remembered, and his shoulders sagged beneath a burden I couldn't see but could feel. I almost invited him inside for coffee. Almost. The words were on my tongue, warm and familiar, but I held them back, because I understood something in that moment that I wished I had learned decades earlier. Compassion without boundaries is not kindness. It is surrender. Instead, I wished him a safe drive. He nodded quietly and left, his taillights disappearing down the street like the last embers of a fire I wasn't sure could be rekindled. I believed the matter might finally be over. I was wrong. Chapter 3: The Key That Wasn't Hers. 2 mornings later, I heard someone unlocking my front door. The sound was unmistakable, the scrape of metal against metal, the click of the mechanism, the soft push of hinges that I keep well oiled. My cleaning service wasn't due until Friday. My book club wasn't meeting until Thursday, and I hadn't invited anyone. I stepped into the hallway just as the door swung open. Vanessa walked in carrying 2 shopping bags, her smile confident, her posture relaxed, as though she were entering her own home on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She simply let herself in, the way you do when you believe a place belongs to you. "I thought I'd start clearing out the basement," she said, already heading toward the stairs. "We'll need room for Mom's sewing equipment." I stepped directly into her path, my body becoming a wall she hadn't expected to encounter. "Stop." She looked surprised, genuinely surprised, as though I were a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly moved. "What? Where did you get that key?" "Oh," she laughed lightly, that tinkling sound that had once seemed charming and now felt like broken glass. "Oliver gave me one ages ago, in case something happened to you." In case something happened to me. The words landed like stones in still water. In case I fell, in case I forgot, In case I became less than I was, less than I am, less than I ever intend to be. I see. She reached for the basement door, her hand already on the knob, her mind already rearranging my home to suit her needs. I caught her wrist, not roughly, I am not a violent woman and I have never been, but firmly enough to stop her, firmly enough to say without words that this was my body, my home, my life, and she had no right to any of it without my consent. Give me the key. Her smile vanished like a candle flame in a hurricane. Seriously, now. She crossed her arms, the shopping bags swinging against her hip. You're being unreasonable. No, my voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman who has buried her husband, raised her son, and survived enough to know the difference between unreasonable and unyielding. I'm protecting my home. Elena, this is family. Family doesn't enter someone's house after they've been told no. She stared at me for several seconds, her eyes narrowing, her jaw tightening. I saw the calculations running behind her gaze, the assessment of whether I was bluffing, whether she could outlast me, whether the prize was worth the battle. Then, with obvious frustration, she dug into her purse and slammed the key onto the hallway table with a sound like a gavel falling. There. Then she pointed a finger toward me, and her voice dropped to a register I had never heard from her before, low, dangerous, stripped of all pretense. One day you'll regret pushing everyone away. I don't push people away. I picked up the key, feeling its weight in my palm, the weight of boundaries finally enforced. I simply refused to be pushed. She spun around and stormed out, letting the front door slam behind her with a sound that echoed through the house like a gunshot. The vibrations traveled through the floorboards, through the walls, through the very foundation of the home Daniel and I had built together. I stood quietly for a moment, the key heavy in my hand, then I picked up my purse. Within the hour, a locksmith had replaced every lock on the front door. He was a young man, polite and efficient, who didn't ask why a woman my age needed new locks on a house she'd lived in for 40 years. He simply did his work, handed me 3 brand new keys, and wished me a good day. One stayed on my key ring. One went into the small safe inside my bedroom closet, behind the photograph of Daniel and me on our wedding day, both of us so young we barely knew what we were promising. The third remained inside my desk drawer, nestled among old letters and paid bills, a backup for a future I was determined to control. No one else received a copy. After thanking the locksmith, I drove to my bank. The teller knew me by name. I've been banking at the same branch for 30 years, and she smiled as I approached her window. But I wasn't there for pleasantries. For years, I'd transferred money every month to help Oliver with Caleb and Lily, my 2 grandchildren. It was never an obligation. It was a gift, given freely and with love, because watching my grandchildren thrive was one of the few joys that had survived Daniel's death. But gifts should benefit the people they're meant for. Instead of ending the payments, I opened 2 separate savings accounts, one for Caleb, one for Lily. The money would continue growing month by month, year by year, until each child became an adult. No one else could touch it, not Oliver, not Vanessa, not anyone who saw my love as a resource to be exploited rather than a bond to be cherished. As I signed the paperwork, I felt something unexpected. Peace, not the peace of victory, because this wasn't a war I had wanted to fight, but the peace of protection, the peace that comes from knowing you have finally, fully, completely stood up for what matters. That afternoon, I returned home, watered my roses, the ones Daniel had planted in his final spring, the ones I had kept alive through 6 winters of grief, and sat beneath the maple tree he had planted decades earlier. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from my neighbor's yard, and somewhere in the distance, a child laughed with the particular abandon that only the very young can manage. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not a polite smile, not a social smile, but a real smile that started somewhere deep in my chest and spread outward like warmth. Boundaries don't always begin with locked doors. Sometimes they begin with quiet decisions no one else even notices. Mine had finally been made, and deep inside I knew this story was far from over. Chapter 4: The money that wasn't hers either. The first day of the new month arrived with bright sunshine and cool autumn air, the kind of morning that makes you believe summer isn't quite ready to surrender. I was sitting in my sunroom with a cup of black coffee, the way Daniel always drank it, the way I've drunk it since the day he died, as though by sharing his habit I can keep some part of him alive, when my phone rang. The screen displayed Vanessa's name. I answered calmly, my voice steady, my heart rate unchanged. Hello. Elena, where's the money? She demanded before I could even say hello, her voice sharp as a blade, stripped of all pretense. What money? The monthly money, for Caleb and Lily. It never reached our account. I took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue before I swallowed. It wasn't supposed to. What does that mean? I've opened savings accounts for both children. Every dollar I plan to give them is going directly into their future. Silence, then came a sharp breath, the sound of someone realizing that a door they thought was open has just been locked. We needed that money. I know. We already paid deposits for summer programs. I'm sure you'll find a way. Her voice became louder, climbing the register from irritation to anger. You had no right to change it without asking. I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. It has always been my gift, Vanessa. A gift isn't an entitlement. You're punishing us. No, I set my cup down, the ceramic clicking against the glass table with a sound like punctuation. I'm protecting my grandchildren. They're our children. And they're my grandchildren. When they turn 18, they'll receive every dollar I've saved for them, every single one, with interest, with growth. With the knowledge that their grandmother loved them enough to protect their future from anyone who would spend it before they could. She let out an angry laugh, a sound like dry leaves scraping against concrete. So this is revenge. It isn't revenge. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the maple tree that had grown from a spindling into a giant, that had survived storms and droughts and the weight of countless winters. It is responsibility. We're family. Family doesn't spend another person's money before receiving it. Family doesn't make financial decisions for someone else without their knowledge. Family doesn't treat love like a line of credit with no limit and no due date. The conversation ended a few moments later, not with goodbye but with a click that was almost violent in its finality. For the first time since all of this had begun, I hung up without feeling guilty. Instead, I felt free. The kind of free that comes from knowing you have finally stopped apologizing for your own existence. A few days later, someone knocked on my front door. Not rang the bell, knocked, a soft, tentative sound like a heartbeat. It was Oliver, alone. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes like bruises, and his shoulders seemed heavier than I had ever seen them, as though he were carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. He wore a jacket I didn't recognize, something too thin for the cooling weather, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. I invited him inside. This time I didn't hesitate, because this time he had come to my door as a son, not as an emissary. We sat across from each other in the kitchen, the same place where he had once done homework while Daniel grilled hamburgers in the backyard, the smell of charcoal and laughter drifting through the open window. The same place where I had bandaged his scraped knees and listened to his broken hearts, and held him when the world felt too big and too cruel for a boy who felt everything too deeply. So, I said softly, pouring him a cup of coffee he didn't ask for but clearly needed, "What brings you here?" He stared into the untouched coffee, his eyes tracing the steam as it rose and vanished. "Vanessa's upset." "I know. She thinks you're trying to divide the family." "I think someone else started that. I didn't say her name, I didn't need to." He sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere below his ribs, from a place where hope and exhaustion had been battling for too long. "We already told Martha she could live here." I looked at him carefully, really looked at him, this man who was still my boy in so many ways. "Did you tell her?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know and broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. "No." "Who did?" "Vanessa." "And why didn't you stop her?" He rubbed his forehead, his fingers pressing into the skin as though he could massage away the thoughts that troubled him. "I didn't want another argument." "There it is." He frowned, confused. "What?" "The real problem." I reached across the table and touched his hand, my fingers covering his, feeling the warmth of the child I had raised and the stranger he had become. "You've spent years avoiding arguments, Oliver. Years choosing peace over truth, comfort over confrontation, silence over standing up for what you know is right." "I just wanted everyone happy." "You can't keep everyone happy when one person ignores everyone else's wishes. You can't build a family on the foundation of one person's demands and everyone else's silence. That isn't peace, it's occupation. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on our joined hands, and I wondered if he was remembering all the times I had held him like this, all the times my touch had been enough to make the world feel manageable. Oliver, I continued gently, this house isn't just property. I know. It's where your father spent the last years of his life. It's where he died peacefully in the bedroom upstairs, with you holding one hand and me holding the other. It's where we celebrated every birthday, every graduation, every small victory that made up the architecture of our lives. It's where I learned how to live without him, one day at a time, one breath at a time, one cup of black coffee at a time. His eyes filled with regret, that particular moisture that men his age try so hard to hide. I never thought about it like that. I know you didn't, I squeezed his hand, but I need you to start. Another long silence settled between us, filled with the ghosts of conversations we should have had years ago. Finally, he whispered, Vanessa says if you don't change your mind, she'll stop bringing the children here. I looked directly into his eyes, searching for the boy who had once trusted me implicitly. Is that a threat? No, he said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. It sounds like one. He lowered his head, his hair falling across his forehead in a way that reminded me so painfully of his father. I don't want to lose either side. You already are. I said it gently, but I said it true. Every time you choose silence over truth, you lose a piece of yourself. Every time you let someone else speak for you, you lose a piece of your voice. And one day, Oliver, you'll wake up and realize that the man in the mirror is a stranger, because you spent so long being what everyone else wanted that you forgot to be who you are. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. I love those children more than anything. I know, and nothing will ever change that. But listen carefully. If someone uses children as bargaining tools, the problem isn't the grandparent refusing to surrender her home. The problem is the person who believes love is a transaction, and children are the currency. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because some truths are too heavy to carry and too important to set down. Before leaving, he stood near the front door for a long moment, his hand on the knob, his back to me. I'm sorry, he said. Those were the only words he spoke, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken apologies, of missed opportunities, of a love that had gotten lost somewhere between intention and action. I watched him drive away, hoping those two words were the beginning of something better, hoping that the boy I had raised was still in there somewhere, fighting to find his way back to the surface. Chapter 5, The Visit That Changed Everything. 2 peaceful weeks passed. The roses continued blooming despite the cooler weather, defiant in their beauty, refusing to surrender to the approaching winter. I played cards every Wednesday with my lifelong friend Grace, who had known Daniel since high school and who never asked me if I was lonely, because she understood that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. I spent quiet evenings reading in Daniel's favorite armchair, the leather worn soft by decades of use, the scent of his pipe tobacco still lingering in the fabric like a ghost that refused to leave. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt earned. It felt like the reward for a life lived with intention, for boundaries maintained with courage, for a love that had outlasted even death itself. One afternoon, I noticed a familiar sedan parked across the street. It sat there for nearly 10 minutes, the engine off, the driver invisible behind tinted windows. Then the door opened, and Martha stepped out slowly. She didn't come to the front door. Instead, she stood by the white picket fence that Daniel had painted every spring for 30 years, running her fingers across the wood, as though searching for answers in the grain. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, as though the past weeks had worn away at her confidence like water against stone. After several minutes, I opened the front door. "Hello, Martha." She turned, looking almost startled, as though she had been caught trespassing in a dream. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all. Would you like some tea?" She smiled weakly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes but tried its best. "I'd appreciate that." We sat together in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had confronted her daughter, where I had held my son's hand, where I had learned that strength doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a woman in her 60s, pouring tea for a woman she barely knows, choosing compassion without surrender. Steam drifted gently from our cups, rising and vanishing like the pretenses that had once sat between us. After a long silence, Martha finally spoke. Vanessa told me you invited me to live here. I shook my head slowly, my eyes steady on hers. No. Her shoulders dropped, a physical manifestation of a hope finally extinguished. I was afraid of that. I never made such an offer. She looked down into her tea, her reflection wavering in the dark liquid. I sold my apartment, I'm sorry. I thought everything had already been arranged. It hadn't. Tears gathered in her eyes, not the dramatic tears of performance but the quiet tears of someone who has finally understood the cost of believing without verifying. I don't know where I'll go now. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cool, slightly papery, the skin of a woman who had lived long enough to know that not all stories have happy endings. I know a wonderful retirement community only a few miles away, I said. I've visited friends there. The gardens are beautiful, the staff is kind, and the residents have more activities than they know what to do with. She looked surprised, her eyes widening slightly. You'd still help me. I won't give away my home, I smiled kindly, but I won't turn my back on someone who was misled. You were a pawn in someone else's game, Martha. That doesn't make you my enemy. It makes you someone who deserves better than the hand she was dealt. Martha squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so fragile. For the first time since we met, we weren't standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. We were simply two mothers trying to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Chapter 6: The folder that held everything. News of Martha's visit spread faster than I expected. In families, information moves like water. It finds every crack, seeps into every corner, and sometimes floods what you thought was secure. 3 days later, just after lunch on Sunday, my doorbell rang. Not the tentative knock of a penitent son, not the silent intrusion of a daughter-in-law with a key. A proper ring, firm and declarative, the sound of someone arriving with purpose. When I opened the door, Oliver stood beside Vanessa. Caleb and Lily waited behind them, their small faces curious and confused, unaware of the storm that had been raging around them. Martha remained quietly near the driveway, her presence a silent witness to a drama she no longer wanted to star in. Vanessa held a thick folder against her chest, its edges crisp and professional, the kind of folder that lawyers use and ordinary people fear. "We need to settle this," she announced, her voice carrying that particular blend of authority and desperation that comes from knowing your time is running out. "I'm not discussing property today," I replied, my body filling the doorway, my presence a boundary she would not cross without permission. "This won't take long." "It already has." She tried to step inside, but I remained firmly in the doorway, an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. "If you've come as family," I said, my voice warm but unyielding, "you're welcome for coffee. If you've come with legal paperwork, then today's visit is over." Vanessa's expression hardened, the mask slipping to reveal the steel beneath. "You should at least hear us out." Against my better judgment, against every instinct that had kept me safe these past weeks, I allowed them into the living room. The children sat quietly on the sofa, Caleb's small hand finding Lily's, their eyes wide with the particular anxiety that children feel when they sense adult tension without understanding its source. Vanessa opened the folder and removed several neatly printed documents, their pages heavy with legal language and threatening possibility. "I spoke with an attorney," she said confidently, as though the word attorney were a magic spell that would compel my compliance. "If you transfer ownership of the house to Oliver now, there will be fewer taxes later. You'll still have the right to live here for the rest of your life." I stared at the papers, my eyes scanning words that were designed to sound like protection while functioning as surrender. And where exactly would I live? She smiled, that particular smile that people use when they believe they've already won. "The basement apartment." I almost laughed, not a joyful laugh, but the kind of laugh that bubbles up when reality becomes so absurd that crying seems insufficient. "The basement. It makes perfect sense. This house has 3 bedrooms upstairs. Oliver and I would need those." "I see." I turned toward my son, really looked at him, searched his face for any sign of the boy who had once built forts in that basement, who had once hidden there during thunderstorms, who had once believed that his mother was the strongest person in the world. "Did you agree to this?" Oliver looked at the floor, his eyes tracing the pattern of the rug that Daniel and I had bought on our 20th anniversary, the rug that had survived 2 dogs, 3 cats, and 40 years of living. I thought it might be practical." "For whom?" Neither of them answered. The silence was so complete that I could hear the children's breathing, soft and synchronized, like the tide coming in. I folded the papers with deliberate care and placed them back on the coffee table, my movements slow and ceremonial, as though I were closing a book that should never have been opened. When Daniel and I bought this house, I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of 4 decades, we worked 2 jobs each. We skipped vacations. We repaired everything ourselves, learning from library books and trial and error. We counted every dollar, saved every receipt, and celebrated every small victory as though it were a holiday. No one spoke. The children were still, their eyes fixed on me, sensing even in their youth that they were witnessing something important. We didn't build this home, I continued, my voice rising slightly, gaining strength from the truth it carried, so someone else could move us into the basement while we were still alive. We didn't plant that maple tree so someone else could sit in its shade and tell us we no longer belonged in its shadow. We didn't raise our son in these walls so that one day he could hand the keys to someone who sees our life as an inconvenience to be managed. Vanessa crossed her arms, her patience finally exhausted. You're making this emotional. Because it is emotional. I looked around the room at the photographs on the mantel, at the clock that had ticked through 40 years of moments, at the bookshelf that Daniel had built with hands that were strong and sure and now forever still. It's only a house to you because you never built anything. You never stayed up until midnight painting walls. You never cried over a broken pipe at 3 a.m. You never held someone's hand while they took their last breath in a room that smelled like lavender and regret. To you, this is real estate. To me, this is everything. I pointed toward the hallway. Oliver took his first steps there on a Tuesday morning in March, while Daniel was home with the flu and I was supposed to be at work. I called in sick that day, and it was the best decision I ever made. I turned toward the fireplace. My husband read bedtime stories beside that chair for 20 years, the same stories over and over until the pages were soft as fabric and the spines were held together with tape and love. Finally, I looked out the window at the maple tree, its leaves turning gold in the autumn light. We planted that tree together before Oliver even started school. Daniel dug the hole and I held the sapling steady, and we both knew it might not survive the winter, but we planted it anyway because some things are worth the risk even when the odds are against you. The room fell silent. Even Vanessa seemed momentarily stunned into stillness, her arguments suspended by the weight of a love she had never bothered to understand. This isn't just property, I said, my voice soft now but no less strong. It's my life. Every room, every photograph, every window, every memory, and you don't get to redecorate my existence because it suits your convenience. Vanessa sighed impatiently, her composure cracking like thin ice. If you don't plan ahead, everyone loses. I already planned ahead. She frowned, suspicious of any plan she hadn't orchestrated. What do you mean? My will has been completed for years. Oliver looked surprised, his eyes widening. You never told me. I didn't need to. Vanessa leaned forward, sensing opportunity. So the house comes to Oliver. It will, her face brightened, a predator-scenting victory, after I'm gone. The smile disappeared instantly, replaced by something darker and more honest. And if anyone continues trying to force me out of my own home, I added calmly, each word a stone placed carefully in a wall that would not fall, I'll change every document tomorrow morning and donate this house to a foundation that supports widows. A foundation that helps women like me keep the homes they built, the lives they earned, the dignity they deserve. Oliver's eyes widened. You wouldn't. I absolutely would. I met his gaze without flinching. I would rather see this house help 100 strangers than watch it become the weapon used to destroy the one person who loved it most. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a warning. You'd punish your own family. No, I remained seated, my posture relaxed, my strength rooted in the certainty that I was right. I'm protecting myself from people who mistake kindness for weakness, from people who believe that love means surrender, from people who look at a life built over 40 years and see only real estate waiting to be developed. For several long seconds, no one moved. The children sat frozen on the sofa, their eyes darting between the adults, sensing the seismic shift that was occurring beneath the surface of their ordinary Sunday. Then something unexpected happened. Martha stood. She walked quietly toward her daughter, her movements slow but deliberate, her eyes fixed on Vanessa with an expression I had never seen from her before, not anger, not disappointment, but a mother's final recognition that her child had lost her way. "That's enough, Vanessa." Vanessa turned in disbelief, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Mom, you never told me Alina said no from the beginning. You let me believe she invited me. You let me sell my apartment. You let me plan my entire future around a lie." Vanessa searched for words that never came, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. Martha looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the weight of apology, the burden of understanding, the grace of someone who has finally seen the truth and chosen to honor it. "I'm sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for." I meant it. Martha had been used, same as I had been, same as Oliver had been. The only difference was that she had finally found the courage to say so. She nodded gratefully. Then she faced her daughter again, her shoulders straight, her voice steady. "We're leaving." Without another argument, without another word, Martha walked toward the front door. Oliver followed silently, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment filled with regret and love and something that might eventually become understanding. Caleb and Lily hugged me before leaving, their small arms tight around my neck, their voices whispering, "Love you, Grandma," with the uncomplicated sincerity that only children possess. They were unaware of everything that had happened around them, protected by a love that refused to use them as weapons. Vanessa remained standing alone in the middle of the living room, the folder still clutched against her chest, her plans in ruins around her. For the first time since this all began, she looked uncertain. The confidence, the certainty, the assumption of victory, all of it had evaporated, leaving behind a woman who had just discovered that the world does not bend to her will. She picked up the folder, avoided my eyes, and walked outside without another word. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of a very long sentence. I stood in the quiet of my living room, surrounded by 40 years of living, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Pride, not in winning because this wasn't a contest, but in standing, in remaining, in refusing to become smaller so that someone else could feel bigger. The house became wonderfully quiet again. Not empty, never empty, but quiet in the way that truth is quiet, in the way that dignity is quiet, in the way that love, real love, needs no announcement to fill a room. Chapter 7: The Son Who Came Home. Over the next several months, life slowly returned to normal. Or perhaps not normal, perhaps something better than normal, something real. I spent mornings tending my garden, pulling weeds and pruning roses, talking to Daniel as though he were still there to hear me. I spent afternoons volunteering at the local library, shelving books and helping children find stories that might light up their imaginations the way books had once lit up mine. The monthly deposits continued growing inside Caleb's and Lily's savings accounts, invisible and secure, waiting for the day each child would begin building a future of their own. Occasionally, Oliver called to ask how I was doing. Our conversations were short but honest, stripped of the pretenses that had once made them performances rather than connections. He didn't mention Vanessa. I didn't ask. Some spaces need time to heal before they can be filled again. Vanessa never called. That silence was its own answer, and I accepted it without bitterness. Some people cannot bear to be around those who have seen them clearly, and I had seen Vanessa more clearly than perhaps anyone ever had. One chilly November evening, another knock sounded at my door. Not the bell, a knock, soft and hesitant, the sound of someone who isn't sure they're welcome. When I opened it, only Oliver stood there. He looked thinner than before, older somehow, as though the months had carved new lines into a face I had memorized long ago. His jacket was the same thin one from before, and his hands were bare against the cold. "May I come in?" he asked softly. I stepped aside. As he entered, I sensed that something important had changed. Whatever battle had been raging inside him was finally coming to an end, and I could see in the set of his shoulders, in the calm of his eyes, that he had chosen his side. He had chosen himself. He had chosen truth. He had chosen, perhaps, me. Oliver stepped inside quietly, closing the front door behind him. He looked around the living room as though he hadn't truly seen it in years, his eyes resting on the framed family photographs, the old grandfather clock, the bookshelf Daniel had built with his own hands. His gaze traveled slowly, reverently, like a pilgrim visiting a shrine he had forgotten he believed in. "I've missed this place," he admitted. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Coffee." He smiled faintly, a real smile this time, small but genuine. I'd like that. A few minutes later, we sat across from each other with steaming mugs between us. The kitchen was warm, lit by the overhead light that Daniel had installed in 1995, the same light that had illuminated countless dinners, countless conversations, countless moments of ordinary magic. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, the silence of two people who have finally found their way back to each other. Finally, Oliver took a deep breath. Vanessa and I separated. I wasn't shocked. The sadness in his face had been telling me that story long before his words did. When did it happen? About a month ago. He stared into his cup, watching the steam rise and vanish. Everything became a fight. It wasn't just about this house anymore. It was about money, control, and always wanting more. More space, more say, more everything. There was never enough for her, and I finally realized that there would never be enough. I listened quietly, my heart breaking and healing simultaneously, the way hearts do when they love someone who has been lost and is finally finding his way home. She wanted me to challenge your will, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. She even spoke to another lawyer. I raised my eyebrows, surprised despite everything. And what did you say? Oliver finally looked me in the eyes, and in his gaze I saw the boy I had raised, the man I had worried about, and something new, something that looked like peace. I told her I would never take my mother's home away from her, not while she was alive, not ever. A gentle smile crossed my face, warm and real, and filled with more love than I had words to express. I'm proud of you. He lowered his head, his hair falling across his forehead. I should have said it much sooner. You finally said it, that's what matters. He nodded slowly, accepting the grace I offered, because he had finally learned to accept grace as well as give it. Martha moved into the retirement community you recommended, he said after a moment. Is she happy there? Very, he smiled for the first time that evening, a smile that transformed his face from tired to tender. She says she's made more friends in a few weeks than she had in years. She has gardening clubs, book groups, even dance nights. She says she's busier than when she owned her apartment. I'm glad. She also wanted me to thank you. There isn't any need. She insists there is. He reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm and strong and finally steady. She says you were the only one who treated her like a person instead of a problem. We sat quietly, letting the conversation settle around us like dust motes in afternoon light. Outside, the wind rustled the maple tree Daniel, and I had planted decades earlier, its branches swaying with the particular grace that comes from deep roots and strong wood. After another moment, Oliver spoke again. I've rented a small apartment across town. That sounds like a fresh start. It is, he hesitated, his thumb tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Would it be all right if I stayed here for a couple of nights while the apartment is being painted? I smiled warmly, feeling something unlock in my chest that I hadn't realized was still closed. Of course. Relief washed over his face, but only for a moment before he added, as your guest. He laughed softly, a sound like water finding its level after a long drought. I wouldn't dare forget that. For the next few days, life felt surprisingly normal. Oliver helped me rake leaves from the yard, the same yard where he had once built snow forts and ridden his first bicycle. He repaired the loose gate Daniel had been meaning to fix before his illness, his hands working with the same competence his father had taught him. We cooked dinners together, talked late into the evening, and shared memories we hadn't spoken about in years, the camping trip where the tent collapsed, the Christmas when Oliver got his first bike, the ordinary Tuesdays that had somehow become the architecture of our love. Little by little, the distance between us disappeared. Not all at once, trust is rebuilt one brick at a time, but steadily, surely, the way the tide comes in. One Saturday afternoon, Caleb and Lily came to visit. The children ran laughing through the backyard, piling colourful autumn leaves into enormous heaps before jumping into them again and again, their shrieks of joy filling the air with a warmth I hadn't felt in far too long. Their laughter filled the house with something I had almost forgotten, the sound of a family that was healing. Oliver watched them through the kitchen window, his expression soft, his eyes bright. I almost lost all of this, he said quietly. I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the muscle and bone of the child I had carried, the man I had worried over, the son who had finally come home. You found your way back. He nodded, his throat working with emotion. I nearly confused peace with giving in. I thought that if I just agreed, if I just went along, if I just kept everyone happy, then I would have peace. But I was wrong. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice. It's knowing that you're standing on solid ground, even when the ground shakes. Many people do confuse them, I said. It takes courage to learn the difference. Now I understand. He turned to face me, his eyes clear and sure. You don't keep a family together by sacrificing one person's dignity. You keep it together by honoring everyone's worth. Exactly, I squeezed his shoulder. Welcome home, Oliver, welcome home. Chapter 8, The Life That Remained. Several weeks later, Martha stopped by for coffee. She looked healthier than I had ever seen her, her cheeks pink with outdoor color, her eyes bright with the particular light that comes from belonging somewhere. She wore a sweater in a color I had never seen her wear before, a vibrant teal that made her look 10 years younger, and she carried a book from the retirement community's reading club. There are gardening clubs, book groups, and even dance nights, she said with a laugh that was genuine and free. I've been busier than when I owned my apartment. Who knew that downsizing would feel like expanding? I'm happy for you, I said, and I meant it. So am I, she reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and grateful. Our friendship wasn't built on years of shared memories, it was built on honesty, sometimes that creates stronger foundations than history ever can. As winter slowly gave way to spring, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Oliver visited every other weekend with the children, and sometimes he came alone just to sit in the kitchen and talk, to remember who he was and who we were together. We baked cookies using my mother's recipe, played board games that ended in laughter rather than competition, and planted flowers in the garden Daniel had loved so much. The savings accounts for Caleb and Lily continued to grow, invisible and secure, waiting for the day each child would begin building a future of their own. Vanessa remained part of the children's lives. I would never have asked Oliver to sever that bond, and he wouldn't have listened if I had, but she never returned to my house. That chapter had closed, not with malice, but with the firm understanding that some doors once locked should remain that way. One sunny afternoon in late spring, Lily looked curiously at the sturdy locks on my front door, her small finger tracing the metal with childish fascination. "Grandma," she asked, her voice filled with the innocent curiosity that makes children's questions so profound, "why do you always lock your house?" I smiled as I brushed a strand of hair away from her face, feeling the softness of her cheek, the warmth of her trust. "So the people who come inside are the ones who are truly welcome." She considered my answer, her brow furrowing in that particular way she had when she was thinking hard about something important. Then she gave me a hug, her small arms tight around my neck, her voice whispering against my ear. "I like coming here. I like having you here." As evening settled over the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, I sat alone on the backyard bench Daniel and I had built together years ago. The wood was weathered now, silvered by sun and rain, but it was still strong, still steady, still holding me up just as I had held up so much else. The golden light filtered through the maple leaves, casting gentle shadows across the lawn where Oliver had once played, where my grandchildren now laughed, where I had walked 1,000 times with Daniel's hand in mine. This house had witnessed birthdays and celebrations, tears and loss, forgiveness and second chances. It had stood through every season of my life, the springs of hope, the summers of joy, the autumns of change, and the winters of grief. It had held me when I was broken, sheltered me when I was afraid, and remained steadfast when everything else seemed to shift. People often believe strength is measured by how loudly someone argues or how forcefully they demand their way. They are mistaken. Real strength is remaining calm when others pressure you to surrender what matters most. Real strength is saying no with love and yes with wisdom. Real strength is knowing that your worth is not negotiable, your boundaries are not suggestions, and your home is not up for discussion. One respectful but unwavering no protected everything Daniel and I had spent a lifetime creating. One word, spoken with love but without compromise, became the foundation upon which everything else was rebuilt. I still drink my coffee black every morning, the way Daniel did, the way I have done since the day he left. I still sleep on the left side of the bed, leaving the right side empty out of a loyalty that time cannot diminish. Some evenings the silence reminds me that I miss my husband, miss him with an ache that never fully goes away, a longing that has become as familiar as breathing. But it also reminds me that every room, every photograph, every window, and every memory remains exactly where it belongs. They belong to me. They belong to us. They belong to the life we built, the love we shared, and the strength I found when I needed it most. Home is more than walls and a roof. Home is the place where your dignity is safe, and mine always will be. What would you have done? So I ask you again, now that you've heard my story, what would you have done? Would you have said yes to keep the peace? Would you have smiled and stepped aside and told yourself that family matters more than boundaries? Or would you have found the strength to say that one small, powerful, life-changing word? Because here's what I learned, and what I hope you remember. The people who truly love you will never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. The people who truly respect you will never treat your home like their property, your generosity like their entitlement, or your love like a transaction. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for your family is to love yourself enough to say no. What will your no protect today?